Now time for the Mike Wagner Show, powered by Sonic Web Studios. Visit online at sonicwebstudios.com for all your needs. The Mike Wagner Show brings you famous celebrities and amazing people from all over the world. Listen online at themikewagnershow.com and on Facebook, SoundCloud, Spreaker, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. And watch the interview on YouTube. So sit back and relax and enjoy the Mike Wagner Show.
Hey everybody, it's Mike from the Mike Wagner Show, powered by Sonic Web Studios. Visit online at sonicwebstudios.com for all your needs. Looking at a professional website without breaking your budget? Sonic Web Studios is the answer. Sonic Web Studios offers fast, affordable custom web designs that blow the competition away. Call today at 1-800-303-3960. That's 1-800-303-3960. Or email to support at sonicwebstudios.com. Mention the Mike Wagner Show, get 10% off your first order. Sonic Web Studios, take your image to the next level. Also, the Mike Wagner Show can be heard on the MikeWagnerShow.com. You can check our Facebook page at facebook.com/the Mike Wagner Show. You can download and listen on Facebook, SoundCloud, Spreaker, Spotify, iHeartRadio. Also, Radio Public and Anchor FM, and also watch the interview on the YouTube channel and subscribe to the Mike Wagner Show on YouTube and take the Mike Wagner Show with you on any mobile device. We're here with a wonderful lady and author, Talia Carner, the author of The Third Daughter, to be released September 3rd, published by HarperCollins. She's worked for Redbook Magazine, publisher of Savvy Woman Magazine, a marketing consultant to Fortune 500 companies, and she also published some other works, as Puppet Child, China Doll, Jerusalem Maiden, and Hotel Moscow. And there is an underlying theme to this, and very committed to a cause, and these are for a good reason, not just for entertainment, but to get a message out there. That's what is going on in the world today. And ladies and gentlemen, live from the East Coast, where things hopefully don't get too crabby up there along the shoreline, Talia Carner. Talia, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Mike. Thank you so much for having me on your show.
It is my pleasure. So you're the author of The Third Daughter, to be released September 3rd, published by HarperCollins. You've also published Puppet Child, China Doll, Jerusalem Maiden, Hotel Moscow. You worked for Redbook Magazine, and you're a one-time publisher of Savvy Magazine, lecturer at the International Women's Forum, marketing consultant to Fortune 500 companies, and you also do a lot of things for a number of causes as well, too. We'll get to that. We know you're very busy, but first of all, very fascinating. Just tell us how it got started.
How it got started. I never expected to be a novelist. I was in the business world, as you just mentioned, in magazine business, but on the business side, not the writing side. And I was also a consultant to Fortune 500 companies, running my own company, and also volunteer counselor for the Small Business Administration. Mm-hmm. When in 1993, I was asked to travel to Russia shortly after the fall of communism to teach women business. Mm-hmm. And I went twice to Russia in that year, 93, in May and in October. And each was a life-changing event for different reasons. I was so touched in May by the women, by their valor, by the situation that was here. They were in one of the world's two superpowers, yet they were reduced to being no different than the African women I had met, who were hunters and gatherers, mm-hmm. in terms of living in an urban surroundings where they still had to find food. So in October, I found myself, unfortunately, caught in the uprising of the Russian parliament against Boris Yeltsin.
Oh, my.
And I ended up being on the run from the militia, and that was published 20 years later in the form of the book called Hotel Moscow. So all of that harrowing experience can be read there. I am not the protagonist, even though I gave her some of my business experience in Russia. but the part that they run from the militia I used for that in that book. But coming back, returning unexpectedly when the U.S. Embassy whisked me out of the country on the first flight after the uprising had been quelled, and I ended up writing a report for the U.S. Information Agency that had sent me as an expert, explaining why I was back after 4 days instead of after 14 days. And that's when I started my writing career. And nothing ever happened from that maiden effort at that time. I'm saying 20 years later, I used the material in another book called Hotel Moscow. But I definitely, at that point, started my writing career. I published then Puppet Child, China Doll, and Jerusalem Maiden before I went back to those experiences in Russia 20 years later and wrote about them. And now I am continuing my writing about social issues. And that is a very interesting way in which subjects always find me. I don't even go around looking for them. The minute a book is not even finished, but it's pretty much underway when the next subject presents itself into my life, in my head, and it turns out that the seeds are very often have been planted years prior in various forms of interest. And that's how the story of the third daughter came about, which is in the book itself is a story about sex trafficking set in Buenos Aires in the late 1800s. What is behind that story is what was a legal union of traffickers that was headquarters in Buenos Aires. And its members would travel to Eastern Europe and prey on the Jewish communities there, where pogroms made them very, very vulnerable. And these men would offer marriages and job opportunities in what they call America. And you can't even, at that time, they didn't even know the difference between North and South America. So we have a situation where the father of this girl, who eventually becomes the protagonist, he says to the trafficker, he says, of course, not knowing that his daughter is going to be forced into prostitution, he says to him, so you're going to America? Good. I have a brother in Pittsburgh. Is Buenos Aires near it? And he says, just south of it. And then, so that was the level of ignorance regarding what was awaiting these poor girls and women. Once the ocean crossing ended, after 3-4 weeks, the women had been raped, beaten, starved, and caged, and tortured, and forced into prostitution in the new land of South America. So the thing about it was that it was legal in Argentina, and until that time, all of this, the trafficking of women until then, in late 1800s, was usually of black and colored women. This was the first time that white women were being trafficked, and that's the words white slavery came from. And the Victor Hugo, the one we know from Les Miserables, wrote about it.
Right.
And there were other voices about it, but nothing was done enough to stop it. In 1920, the League of Nations, which was the organization prior to the establishment of the United Nations, had a conference on the subject of white slavery and made a variety of decisions. But as I'm saying, in Buenos Aires and Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and Montevideo in Uruguay, it was legal to own these women the way that in the United States blacks were owned by white people.
Mm-hmm.
So once they were captured, they were owned, and they were registered, which is amazing. And that is what the book is about. And of course, one character, and I crawled under her skin to feel the emotions and the torture and what happened. But with that, she found some moments of happiness. She gets in the coming years, she becomes a tango dancer, and she loves the adulation of the crowds, for example. But also she gets the chance to cooperate with the local prosecutor who is trying to bring down this union. And I'm not going to talk more about the plot of the book other than to say that it's an emotional roller coaster, both for me and the reader. And every time the reader is surprised, I was surprised myself. And the strength of any novel, at least any novel that readers get really captured and captivated, is have a moral dilemma. And the moral dilemma of Batya, the protagonist of the third daughter, is whether to commit suicide or not. And she had promised her family to bring them out of Russia, out of the anti-Semitism of Russia. And if she stops, she can't tell them what has happened to her, but if she kills herself, they are going to be lost there. And she continues to live in her own private hell in order to take them out of their hell. So it's a big moral dilemma, and other moral dilemmas come along the way as she is tempted to cooperate with one person or another. Her relationship with some of her customers become warmer and more interesting. They are not flat and lack in texture. They each person brings into her bedroom a different personality. So all of that is very interesting to me. But from what I hear now from readers of the very early reviews, it's quite thrilling and interesting to the readers as well.
That sounds amazing too. And of course, a question that came to my mind about the when this whole slavery thing happened in Buenos Aires and part of Argentina. What was the economy like back then in Argentina?
It's very interesting. Argentina was just beginning to flourish, and Argentina wanted newcomers, and it wanted European stock. So they actually opened an office in Paris and had consuls traveling around Europe and trying to get a variety of people to come to immigrate to Argentina. And surely enough, today Argentina's population is not as Mayan and Hispanic as some of the other South American countries. So the government was very much interested in its growth. It's also, they had a new, at one point in the late 1885, they had a new military commander who became the general, but he was a man with vision, and he got this huge tracts of land in the La Pampas, and he wanted to establish towns and cities there. So they were very accommodating. The other part of it is that the budget of the Argentine government, 25% of it came from taxes on brothels.
Wow.
So they had a big interest in that. And since they had this huge influx of mostly men, immigrants who came as single men looking for the opportunities, or married men who left their families behind, but there was a huge influx of men, then as a Catholic country, the government believed that having brothels, quote, protected good women and families, close quote.
Wow.
So they encouraged it. And actually, going back a few years prior to the time I'm talking about, the Jesuits in Brazil wrote to Europe, to the Queen of Spain, and asked to send prostitutes in order to protect good women in Brazil. So, so that was the Catholic mentality at the time, which made all of this enslaving of girls possible. What is interesting to me today is that the methods of traffickers have not changed. And today we have this sex trafficking that's happening all over the world, all over the globe, including, of course, the United States, where girls and women are being lured by false promises of jobs.
And that's a really sad reality too. And of course, getting back to Argentina and everything, how much corruption was there in the government involving the involving with I can't think right now. It's like involved with brothels and everything else. How much corruption was in there? And if
Yes.
they were charged, it's like, what were the indictments? Were they guilty? Did they throw out the case, or was it like in bribes?
It was very corrupt because the traffickers, the union was called Zwi Migdal, ZWI, MIGDAL. That union did what it did in terms of ownership of prostitutes did legally, but they did a lot of things illegally because, for example, prostitution was legal, but they were tremendous amount of regulations, such as 3 times a week health check, allowing the prostitutes to keep their earnings, allowing them free movement, so that they supposedly could be free to move and go around and keep the money. And all of that was not being kept. 100% was not being adhered to. But also they were involved in other forms of corruptions to corrupting judges and lawyers and police. And the police very often was on their payroll. So if a girl ran away, the police would bring her back and would tell her that she was owned by her, quote, husband. They consider them like as if they were married. I mean, it was really very, very corrupt, and that brought additional consequences, which was one of the reasons that they were the good people who were trying to bring down this organization, Zwi Migdal, but the corruption in all levels of governments and the judicial system was so high that it was hard to get any one person to do that until in 1919 there was one DA who managed to get one prostitute to talk to him. She decided that she can only die so many times, and she put her life in his hands and testified, and he did his investigation, and her name was Raquel Lieberman, and he did a raid on all of the homes of the pimps, except that, of course, they had been tipped off, and quite a few hundreds of them escaped just before. 300 were arrested over a period of 1 week, which means that when the first one was arrested, all the others already were informed about what was going on. And he also did it with the media, with photographers, and so on. So it wasn't a quiet event. 300 were arrested, 109 were charged, and only 3 were actually got jail time.
Wow. That is something. And of course, and I think with social media as well, too, do you think the sex trafficking has increased or made it more aware, or is it being more encouraged for other countries to be corrupt?
I don't think that there is the problem is corruption on our level internationally probably. The problem is a slightly. I'm looking at the paradigm of sex trafficking, and that is you have suppliers, and demand.
Mm-hmm.
The supply of people who live in misery and poverty and strife around the globe is huge, and that supply is not going to be dwindling down anytime soon. So people are willing to take the risk and come to America or to any European country and take their chances is very high. And now, by the way, I want to say 2/3 of sex trafficking in the United States is from abroad and 1/3 is domestic. And I'll address that in a few minutes. But
That's
just
fine.
speaking about the supply is huge. The suppliers or the traffickers, as long as they stand to make huge profits, they are willing to take the risk of punishment, and the punishment, unfortunately, in our society, has not come nearly as close to the profits that they make.
Mm-hmm.
Or so we have not used a lot of teeth against them at all. And now is the question of demand. The demand is actually the weakest link here, because it's men mostly versus women. It's men, and they are very vulnerable to exposure.
Mm-hmm.
And if they know that should they get caught, they will be publicly exposed, they will forgo a lot of those sexual services.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that brings me to the idea that the victims of traffickers, the prostitutes, are never in that situation of their own free will. Even domestically, those are people who have been sexually molested all through their childhood.
Mm-hmm.
They come from a variety of homelessness, foster care system, a variety of abuse that had been going on for years, where moving into a life of prostitution is not much different than the life they have led their entire youth.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea is that they have not selected it of their own free will, and there's somebody behind them, regardless of the Swedish law, by the way, such that it says that regardless of how the woman behaves and dresses and speaks and solicits, she is a victim of somebody. And therefore, she's not committing the sex act out of her free will, but according to Swedish law, it's a rape. And since it's a rape, the man is then a rapist. He is a criminal. And that is the Swedish law. In our society, we are not ready to take this paradigm to this extreme, but we definitely can begin to see that there is a responsibility on the men who seek sex.
Mm-hmm.
And what is their vulnerability to exposure should that they be found. And it's easy, it's pretty clear to see that it may go down tremendously, their demand for sex services, should that they be exposed. Mm-hmm. And there is an organization, there are many organizations have been in touch now. One is called BEST, Businesses Ending Sexual Trafficking. And what BEST does is they have developed new regulations that are adopted by human resources and corporate management and even small companies against using the company's time and computers and anything that's owned by the company, from trucks and facilities, to use for the sexual exploitation. So, for example, do you know when is the peak time for purchasing of sex services?
Good question. And I'd see.
Okay.
I'm thinking of either the 4 seasons, the months. My
No, I'm
guess is
talking
between
the peak
spring.
time, the peak time of the day,
Oh,
peak hour, peak
okay.
hour.
I was going to say summertime. I'm thinking somewhere at midnight
It's 2 p.m. actually.
in the afternoon. Really, around summertime, the spring, the
No,
winter,
no,
anytime.
forget about that's not doesn't go by season.
Okay.
2 p.m. 2 p.m. and I'm not talking about purchasing sex pornography, which is a passive form of using the company's time, but actually making the arrangements for sexual purchasing of sexual services to be used then or later or whatever. 2 o'clock, which means it's on company's time. So it's
Company
very
time,
easy.
seriously.
So it's very easy for companies, small, medium, large, whatever, to put in these regulations against using any of the company's resources. And that's including when people go on a 3-day conferencing and so on. But what's interesting, I was told by the top executives at Best, is that should an employee be found to be violating the regulation, the unions are with the employer.
Mm-hmm.
And that is very important because very many employers don't want to start, even if an employee has erred, they don't want to start dealing with the unions and long protracted hearings and so on. But to find out that the unions are with the companies against purchasing of sexual services on companies' time, that makes it a lot easier to deal with that. And then it also brings it back to exposure, because there is a huge risk for the man who then breaks the company's regulation.
Wow, that is something. We'll talk more about that, and of course, we'll talk about the Swedish law, the state in America, and everywhere else around this hot issue. You listen to the Mike Wagner Show at the MikeWagnerShow.com, powered by Sonic Web Studios. Visit online at SonicWebStudios.com for all your needs. Looking for a professional website without break your own budget? Sonic Web Studios is the answer. Sonic Web Studios offers fast, affordable custom web designs at below the competition way. Call today at 1-800-303-3960. That's 1-800-303-3960. Or email to support at SonicWebStudios.com. Mention the Mike Wagner Show. Get 10% off your first order. Sonic Web Studios. Take your image to the next level. Also, the Mike Wagner Show can be heard on the MikeWagnerShow.com. Also, check our Facebook page, Facebook.com/The Mike Wagner Show. You can download and listen on Facebook, SoundCloud, Spreaker, Spotify, iHeartRadio. Also, Anchor FM and Radio Public. Also, watch the interview on YouTube on the Mike Wagner Show channel and take the Mike Wagner Show with you on any mobile device. We're here with Talia Carner, the author of The Third Daughter, to be released September 3rd, published by HarperCollins. She also wrote Puppet Child, China Doll, Jerusalem Maiden, Hotel Moscow, with this intertwining theme of sex and human trafficking, and we talked about the details of it, and of course, getting to the Swedish law, considering rape and the state of it in America as well, too, and going from like the most strict to the most lenient, say from Sweden. Where would you say like the strictest going down to the most lenient or the most corrupt in terms of countries?
I would say that, Southeast Asia is a hotbed of sexual exploitation of children as young as 8 years old or even younger. And the government is very familiar with the fact that there is what they call sex tourism, people who travel from other countries to Thailand to have sex with children and definitely minors. In the United States, is a crime. It's considered a crime to travel to another country for that purpose. But the globe is filled with problems and human misery. Cambodia is another country. I mean, it's really bad. In countries such as South America, where my novel is set, having it has become historically going to prostitutes for men was a lot more of a pastime than it probably was in other countries. I've not compared yet all the histories of one country whether against another, but it was more of a common type of recreation, so that some brothels became like a club. In the case of in the hotel in the third daughter, the brothel where she's employed is like a club. They play cards, they do business deals. They don't necessarily are in a rush to have the private time with their favorite prostitute. They drink, they eat, it's a club, and that's a lifestyle. So I would say that probably South America. I'm not sure that I'm an expert on all prostitution in all over the globe in the entire history from the beginning of humankind, but it definitely, I have a sense that had become more of the norm in South America in the late 1800s and definitely all through the 1900s. The other countries that are mostly the more insightful and enlightened the countries are, and we always bring up the Scandinavian countries as a whole, one after another, that have more of an enlightened type of laws, and it's a world view of a world where women have a lot more value and they are not being objectified as much, even though I can tell you that in those countries still women don't find themselves completely on par with men, but they're definitely in many ways in a lot better situation than women elsewhere. So my the way I write about different social issues, this is one that happened to capture me back in 1995. I was at the International Women's Conference in Beijing. And I had, until then, because I was in the business world, and I mentioned to you just 2 years before, I was twice in Russia teaching women business. I always believed that economic freedom was the first freedom that women needed, because if they were economically independent, they could leave a bad marriage. In Africa, I saw them buying computers for girls, opening schools. Women, whenever you educated women and you gave them business opportunities, they did something very positive with that. So I believed in that, and that's why I was working on it in 1993 until I arrived in Beijing in 1995. And I discovered something that I had been somewhat blinded to in many ways, and that is I was introduced to clitoridectomy of women in all of Africa and Muslim countries where they are being incised in their private parts in order to end their sexual enjoyment. And we are talking 80 million women in Africa at any given time are mutilated this way. So, and I was introduced to the burning of the brides in India, where disputes between families over dowry continue years after the woman had been married and has children, and miraculously by chance she gets burned in her kitchen. It's such a phenomenon we don't see anywhere else. So I was introduced all of a sudden to violence against women as a first freedom that we needed. All this time I thought we to focus on economic freedom, and all of a sudden I discovered that violence against women was the first thing we needed freedom from. And that is where my novel Puppet Child, which deals with molestation and the way family courts in the United States ignore children whose mothers come to the courts and ask for protection by actually putting the children in the hands of their molesters. And then China doll is infanticide in China, when I realized that 1.3 150,000 girls disappear in China every single year. Okay, and that's still true today after they relaxed their one-child policy. The numbers, unfortunately, are staggering.
Wow.
So that the killing of babies, if we don't have the right to live, if that's not the first right, then I don't know what is the first right. And that went on, and that is what changed my perspective. And at that 1995 International Women's in Beijing, I heard a testimony by a Filipina woman, a tiny little old woman who was standing on stage and crying to high heavens about the injustices that had been done to her because during World War II, she had been captured by the Japanese army, and along with tens of thousands other women in all of the Pacific Rim were put into what they called comfort stations, where to serve the sexual needs of the Japanese army.
Wow.
And decades later, this woman was still seeking justice and an apology from the Japanese government, an acknowledgement of a war crime that was never forthcoming.
Wow. Unbelievable.
And this little old woman had an operatic voice. She was tiny. When she stood there and she spoke, and I heard from the interpreter through my headset, I heard the interpretation. But I could hear this operatic voice. It was fantastic. And it stayed in my head. I still hear it now when I think of what happens to subjugated women. And that's what was the beginning. I mentioned to you sometimes seeds are planted in my head. The sexual subjugation of women, the marrying off of girls who are child brides is happening still a lot in the U.S., where we either import or export, especially with some minorities of certain immigrant minorities are still doing that with their 12 to 14-year-olds before the girls have enough brain and freedom and ability to rebel and say no in a more American way. And the parents ship them off back to Pakistan and Afghanistan and all kinds of countries where they marry them off to older men. So all of this is all part of the same sexual subjugation by force.
Wow.
Whether it's prostitution, whether it's the use of rape as a tool of war, or whether it's a bride, as I'm saying, child brides, all of this is the part of the same phenomena of sexual subjugation of women.
That is unbelievable. And of course, I just had something that just popped up on my head as well, too, that how is the economy and the violence all come together? Will like, if you have a good economy, will the violence go down, or will the bad economy increase the violence? So it's just like, you have like the up and down factor about the economy and violence when it comes to sex trafficking.
It's an interesting attempt at putting it together. I'm not sure that it's completely cause and effect, because in some cases you can say that unless there is a social stigma to it or a different way of looking at the place of women in the world that are not sexual objects to satisfy the sexual needs of men, then that I think what makes a difference, not so much the economy, because in poor countries, for example in India, where it's huge poverty, using prostitutes is a recreation when somebody can't afford to go to the movies. So it's not necessarily, I don't think it's completely the economy. And I mentioned India. In India, there's because it's the class, the differentiation there is so strict that there is a caste of the untouchable, but within the untouchable were those bred for prostitution. So there is a group that they are born and the children are being taught to become prostitutes.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, I think it's not so much attached to economy as culture and the view of women.
Mm-hmm. The only reason I mention it is because I remember when Gorbachev was in power around the 80s, is that when the economy was at an all-time low, and Gorbachev was trying to bring in capitalism, it seemed like the prostitution and sex trafficking was high, but then when the economy was doing really well, it seemed like everything was low because, man, the women went back to work. So I don't know if that's something that you agree with, but that's what I'm suspecting as well, too. I have another question for you in regards to the women in business in Russia, but first you can answer about what I mentioned as well.
Yeah, my view of Russia maybe is that we all know Moscow and St. Petersburg that are flourishing and becoming very modern. At the time I was there in 1993, there was no restaurant, not off the street restaurant. Somebody gave you a secret address and you walked up a couple of flights of steps and you knocked on a door like a code, up, bum, 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 or something. Mm-hmm. And then somebody opened the door and then there were 2-3 tables and that was a restaurant.
Wow.
So it wasn't what people see today when they know about Moscow and St. Petersburg. But Russia is huge. It's now across 9 time zones. It used to be 11. They've kind of consolidated some. Still 9 time zones. It has many, many cities, industrial cities, that are so bleak that it doesn't have a single tree. It doesn't have the weather. There's no social services. There's nothing to keep people interested. Mm-hmm. The life of Russians in many of those cities could be in the Urals, it could be in Siberia, it could be, I would say it's better in the central south, like Kazakhstan and those areas where it's the breadbasket of all of this former Soviet Union. That's where the land is more fertile and you get food and you get greenery. I think that having some greenery is very important for people's morale.
Amazing.
But if they live up in the northern part of Russia, in those bleak industrial cities where it's nothing but smoke from the chimneys and those steel mills and coal mines and gas fields, those are horrible places. So. Mm-hmm. I cannot say that the life of women in those cities has improved. I don't know enough, but my sense is that it's far from being a happy life there. And they are very much in demand for traffickers because they tend to be very good-looking women. They are blonde, blue-eyed, tall, sometimes voluptuous, and they are very much in demand, and that is where traffickers can come and recruit, put ads, have auditions for what they say that we are auditioning for a movie in Berlin or wherever it can be, and they get these women to fall into their traps.
I think that's something we'll touch upon. We'll talk about the business aspect in just 1 minute. You listen to The Mike Wagner Show at themikewagnershow.com, powered by Sonic Web Studios. Visit online at sonicwebstudios.com for all your needs. Looking for a professional website without breaking your budget? Sonic Web Studios is the answer. Sonic Web Studios offers fast, affordable custom web designs that blow the competition away. Call today at 1-800-303-3960. That's 1-800-303-3960. Or email to support@sonicwebstudios.com. Mention the Mike Wagner Show. Get 10% off your first order. Sonic Web Studios. Take your image to the next level. Also, the Mike Wagner Show can be heard on themikewagnershow.com, Also, check our Facebook page, facebook.com/The Mike Wagner Show. You can download and listen on Facebook, SoundCloud, Spreaker, Spotify, iHeartRadio, also on Anchor FM and Radio Public. Also, watch the interview on the YouTube channel on The Mike Wagner Show. You can also take The Mike Wagner Show with you on any mobile device. We're here with author Talia Carner, the author of The Third Daughter, to be released September 3rd, published by HarperCollins. She worked for Redbook Magazine and Savvy Woman Magazine, and also wrote Puppet Child, China Doll, Jerusalem Maiden, and Hotel Moscow. Well, we covered a lot of the books and talked about the sex and human trafficking issues as well too. And of course, she made 1993 flight to Russia to talk about business. 1995 went to a women's conference in Beijing. 1993 in Russia, I was going to ask you as well, talking about business with these Russian women. Now, was like a conversion going from communism over to capitalism at that time? Or were they still in communism mode? Or was capitalism kicking in at that time for the Russian women?
Supposedly, with the fall of communism, Russia, or the former Soviet Union with its many republics, was getting into free market economy. Mm-hmm. But when you have a situation where overnight all laws are erased off the books, which is what happened when you remove what they call communism, which was never really the real communism, as it was a totalitarian. It was a totalitarian oppressive regime under that name. So when you remove all laws off the books, when you have more than a billion people, not a billion, I'm sorry, a million, and I forgot how many millions were at that time.
What does it say from a million to a billion? Let's just say that. It's a lot of people.
I'm sorry. No. It's more than the U.S., so it's maybe 400 millions. I don't recall the number. But when they wake up the next morning with no laws on the books, we have this romantic view that people wake up the next morning to democracy. Uh-huh. But is that what happens when they wake up in the morning with no laws? Who rises immediately to fill the gap, if not the most brutal, violent segments of society? So what you had was not a transition that was taking place over a period of time through education and through changing the institutions that govern all of life, all service institutions. But overnight, women lost all social services, which included medical services, which there weren't much in a country that never had a Band-Aid or a toothpaste. But still, whatever services had been available before, the education, the free lunches that the children were getting at the schools and these mothers were getting in their offices and the factories. That's the big meal of the day is around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 1 to 2 o'clock. And they because they couldn't cook those kind of meals in their communal apartment where anywhere from 5 to 15 families shared one kitchen. Mm-hmm. So you had all those social services erased off the books, all laws disappeared, and these women found themselves not in an economy that was good for them, but rather bewildered by all of those changes. And the women I met were two groups, I would say. One was the very highly educated bridge engineers and doctors, and very highly educated women. And at the same time, these women lost their jobs and they needed to find new ways to survive. And they had zero understanding of business, of any basic ideas that we have, for example, networking. Mm-hmm. In a country that was so conditioned to suspicion and distrust, when so many, when the apparatchiks, the leaders, were spewing all kinds of slogans that nobody believed in, that the lies were lying you into your face. Nobody believed anything. And they had double speak and triple speak, and nobody believed anything straightforward. So you didn't have the basic of business. We don't even realize how day to day we deal with people with the assumption of decency. We don't always operate according to the law, meaning that, yes, but according to the law, but that's not the reason. The reason is we have those Judeo-Christian ideas of decency. So when I put down my handbag, I expect that nobody picks it up because it will be quite rare. I have a basic kind of trust if I go to a store that if I pick up something and I give them the money, they will give me the change. They're not going to somebody run away with my money. These constant little exchanges that we do where we assume decency on the other part. But when you don't have that, you don't have any judicial system. They didn't have lawyers. They didn't have courthouses. None existed. It's also in the business world. They did not even begin to know how to trust somebody to exchange information. So that was a very difficult situation and I'm talking about educated women. The uneducated women would be the groups that had those cooperatives, and I dealt with those that I mostly had under 1,000 employees. And these women had always had business given to them. Let me give you a specific example. I went into a factory that produced household brushes. And the government used to send their raw material, tell them what kind of brushes, small, medium, large, brooms, whatever they needed. The women, hundreds of women were sitting at their machines producing them. And then the government would send somebody with trucks to take it and then distribute it God knows where, and obviously it was sold someplace. Then the government would put in the bank account of the cooperative the money for cash payment for every Friday. The women were getting the cash payment because the banking system was very primitive. You didn't have like individual say they had some saving accounts, but not like direct deposit or something like that.
Right.
And but the money that the government put in it had nothing to do with the production or the product. It had to do with how much the government decided each employee got, and to pay for some utilities. Utilities were not that high.
Wow.
They're always subsidized. So now, with the fall of communism, the government disappeared from the picture. The women were sitting, I was there 16 months after the fall of communism. The women had had enough raw material to continue to produce, but now they had mountains of brushes of all sizes, and not one was leaving the place. And nobody was putting money in their account. So I picked up, so first of all, they elected one of their own to become the director. And the director didn't have any clue that more than the other 600 or 800 women working there. And she didn't know about marketing. She didn't know about looking for distribution, to find access, to find trucking companies. Trucking companies, that's another private enterprise. It didn't exist. So these women, so I was there and trying to first of all figure out how we can get out of this mess. So I pick up a brush, everything was done through an interpreter. Every sentence, every paragraph, every concept had to be repeated. So I pick up this brush and I say, how much is it? and they give me a number that I thought I misunderstood, or the interpreter misunderstood, because it came to $150,000.
$150,000 sounds like the
Yeah.
price is right.
So
Oh my
after I repeated
goodness.
that, turns out that because they hadn't sold anything, they were putting all of their account on the first brush they would ever sell, and that number was growing every week as their expenses were growing.
Wow.
They didn't know about pricing.
Oh my goodness. So
They had no knowledge of anything, and there was nobody to help them. So I developed a 3.5-hour workshop working with what they had somebody called the economist in every one of those cooperatives. And I don't know what they taught economists in Russia, because I studied for a master's degree in economics, and I can tell you the pricing is always a very important part of any economics degree. And these economists never heard of pricing. So I don't know what they taught in Russia. But understanding the beginning of business was so far for them. So what these women were doing now, they had to feed their family.
wow.
So there would be somebody from the outside coming and saying, I'll buy your Veskel. Veskel was the share when the communism fell. The cooperative became private and owned by all of these women, and each one got this, it's like a stock, but it's a piece of paper saying you are now an owner for this percent or something. This is your share. So now somebody would come in and say, okay, I'll buy your Veskel for half the price.
Uh-huh.
They didn't have a choice, and they didn't understand that when they were selling the right, they were selling the business.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't get it. So now this is how the oligarchs developed. Oligarchs came and started buying industries, started buying factories this way, exactly as I am describing to you. And that was the transition to supposedly market economy, where within a few years the top Fortune millionaires were from the former Soviet Union.
That is amazing. And it went from like in 16 months to a communist, where it's like the government takes home a certain amount of pay, and the women worked irregardless of hours to conditions or how well they put out the product, to where it's like, they just produce a product, they make money off it. Sounds like it took 16 months or longer, and that is just, wow, amazing. Go from like 16 months. Wow. I'm happy for them.
Well, it depends. So if they learn what to do and were able to find ways to market their products, that was a very good thing. And that's where I and many of my colleagues came. I was in a group in both of my trips. I was in groups of others. So that is just to give you a brush stroke of what the transition from communism was. Not an easy one at all.
I have to say this, I've been following the whole situation, and when the economy started blooming, and I heard of stories where it's like there's like several brands and people were going crazy until they got the concept and everybody was enjoying. And next thing you know it, where it's like, I have to say that the Russians were coming to the U.S., U.S. was coming to Russia, buying each other's goods, and then you started having performers performing in different countries. So that's what I was trying to get at. It's like, how long did it take? And I have to say, that was just an amazing transition. And with the number of women that are working and seeing the rise in capitalism, do you think that's a good way for them to get out of the sex and human trafficking and prostitution?
I can say that I am not sure that all of this development has reached into all parts of society in the former Soviet Union. I've met some young people. I delivered a presentation to the London School of Economics where there were quite a few, about 12 students who were between the age of 28 and 38. Half of those 12 were women. And they were amazing. Their English was as good as mine because they were already grew up on American language TV, so they could speak beautifully with very little accent, and they were very educated. They were from the main cities. Those were just 7 women out of 6 women out of many. The older people were still in a very bad shape. Women in the many, many places I've just mentioned to you, many bleak cities and towns that are completely forgotten, and they are not, I don't believe that their situation is good, and that is why it makes them so vulnerable to promises of traffickers. And so much so that they are called, these one name to the trafficking, to those women, they called Natasha. Everyone is called Natasha. They don't even bother to call them anything else. To
Natasha,
those girls,
interesting.
Yeah,
good thing I didn't call my kids that. Natasha.
The Natashas is the name, and the same way as in South America, in the time that my book was written, the word for prostitutes was established as Polaka, which means the Polish, because that's where many of the Jewish women who were captured were brought in, and until today in South America, Polaka is the word for a prostitute.
Wow.
So it came from that time where white slavery began to arrive in South America. And that's the importance of my novel, is to open up. I heard these cries of these women that nobody was listening to. I estimate there were about between 150,000 to 220,000 Jewish girls and women victims
of that
Tzvi Migdal over a period of 70 years.
Unbelievable.
So that is the third daughter, brings us back to that story.
Mm-hmm. And there's also another question that just popped up as well, too. You talked about the Middle East. You talked about America, North and South America, also the Middle East and Asia as well, too. What about sex and human trafficking in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, and up in Greenland and Iceland? I don't think we've touched those areas.
I must tell you that I really do not have up-to-date information about that. I am not an expert on every misery in every hot spot on a globe. So I imagine it happens everywhere, but in some countries, I would think there's probably less countries that have the borders are pretty secure, like Australia and New Zealand that you just mentioned. Mm-hmm. They have very strong control over who comes in. So it's not completely open to everybody. And therefore, they may have a little bit, I'm assuming, that does not mean that prostitution doesn't exist. I want to bring it back to the domestic prostitution that happens in the United States. And that is, I mentioned to you, a third is domestic. And what happens is the age of recruitment, I think we just mentioned earlier, is between 12 to 14 years old, of recruitment of young people in the United States into prostitution. Mm. So how does that happen? Where are those 12 to 14-year-olds? They are in the schools. Uh-huh. So there are many ways, but they are the vulnerable population. They are the ones who may be socially isolated. They may come from families in crisis where maybe a parent just died, or there's a very sick sibling that takes all of the family's attention. There are a variety of crises, not even to mention the homelessness and the foster care system. The foster care system is completely broken, and it is really filled with sexual abuse to a point that is it's an awful system. So, but these children are at schools. There are now programs, an organization called protectnow.org, which is started in California, and Governor Brown 10 years ago signed it into I don't know if it's law or recommendation, and most of the counties in California have established this curriculum in the school starting at 4th grade, all through the school years, age appropriate, a variety of ways to teach children to be aware of situations, but also to recognize it among their peers. If, let's say, a girl who comes from a poor home all of a sudden has a very expensive iPhone, then how does she come to possess it? And maybe she has an older boyfriend who sooner or later is actually trying to recruit her. And there is now programs for first of all, the school boards have to be on it, and the teachers, and there's a complete protocol, which is on protectnow.org, complete protocol, what the teachers can or should be doing should they suspect, and how to ask the right questions of that student. There are different ways. Here's one more interesting thing for all parents and grandparents and among your listeners. Until 2015, there was a survey done among children that had been rescued from prostitution. And until 2015, turns out they had first met their recruiter in person. The first contact was in person.
Oh, my goodness.
Maybe in a mall or at the bus station or in a schoolyard, because there are school gangs operating everywhere. But since 2015, turns out the majority of first contact has been done online.
I was just going to get to that part where it's like, having social media just seems to increase and make it more accessible for that. That's what it sounds like.
And not too long ago, I remember 15 years ago or so, as a parent, we were told to watch our children's emails and make sure we know whom they correspond with, who is allowed to write to them, or how to sort out and put blocks on strangers and so on. Now, every app, every game that the kids are on has its side conversation, has its own side messenger system, correspondence. So it's impossible to control, and that is where pedophiles exist and operate. That's where they're looking for their next victims. And now the children are recruited directly in their own home.
Unbelievable. Wow. Yeah, that's just a really sad sight. And the website is protectnow.org to get more information or what to do to prevent your 12, 14-year-old daughter to not become a victim of sex and human trafficking, protectnow.org.
Yes, and that program is they are moving now into Nevada, but I hope that it will continue. I would like to say that there are dozens of anti-sex trafficking organizations working all over the country, nationally and locally. And on my website, I put in a page of activism. What can you do? First of all, it's a long article explaining the different players. I mentioned to you the businesses, what businesses can do, but they are the airlines and the hotels and the prisons and the schools. All of these players in that sex trafficking that takes place, and your listeners can find out their own local organization that may help them if they want to volunteer, if they want to do something to remove this evil in their own backyard. There are different organizations. It's all on my website under the third daughter. There is a link to a page that is what can you do in activism.
And that's really important to know, too. And when you talk about activism, you go to these countries and conferences and everything else. And another question that popped up to mind when it comes to safety, do you ever get death threats when it comes to speaking out about sex and human trafficking, or is it like a well-received?
I have not. I'm just starting because my novel is coming out next week, so I haven't yet been on my book tour. And your program is one of the very first that I've been talking to. So
Amazing.
I would say that I haven't yet started, but I have dozens of speaking engagements lined up for the next many, many months. And if history shows, I'll be talking about it for 4 years, which in every one of my previous novels, my book tour continues 2 to 4 years. And usually it ended only because I got burned out, not because I wasn't invited to continue to talk. But I would say that I've never received death threats about anything, but because of China Doll, which deals with infanticide in China,
Uh-huh.
I have been banned from China.
Oh, really? All because of China Doll? Oh, my goodness.
My claim to fame is that I cannot go to China.
Wow. And of course, I guess it takes on a different meaning with the David Bowie song. So, it was just, amazing. Wow.
Yeah, I do want to mention, since I mentioned my website, I'd like to give the spelling of my name to those listeners who want to follow as to what to do. And also they can read the first chapter of my novel, and they can also read more about the background, about the behind that time and place. But so the website is www.taliacarner.com. That is spelled TALIACARN as in Nancy, ER.com.
That is amazing too. That's good to know. And just a couple more things really quickly. Who do you consider biggest influence in your career?
You know, it's an interesting thing. I would say earlier on, it was my husband, Ron, who, when I told him back in late 1993, when I began to write fiction, I said to him, I want to close my company, which meant I was going to be a kept woman. And he said, okay, honey. So that was the first thing, because having the financial security to pursue writing fiction full time was a very big thing, and to have his trust in me, because as you hear, I have an accent, and I was born and raised in Israel, and my English was always good, but not necessarily at a literary level. And he is still fascinated by me. And now he just read Third Daughter. I only give him my books when they are done. And he is, every time he's amazed, I knew. But he's been a great supporter. But since after the first 2 books, my editor at HarperCollins became the one. She doesn't even know, I guess, the level of trust that I have in her. I only tell her about an idea when I get it. Then she doesn't hear from me for a few years, because it takes me anywhere between 2 to 5 years to research and write a novel. And then she gets the book, and as turns out, she loves it, and one after another. So the fact that I know that she's waiting there and she's going to love my book, and she trusts that what I write is going to be something she would want to buy and publish, is a tremendous amount of inspiration. It's a great sense of trust in my abilities to take raw material that historical fiction or any part of my research brings up, and then take this raw material and make it into a compelling novel, not a nonfiction book that is a bit drier, but rather one full of emotions. I mentioned the roller coaster of emotion that takes the reader up and down. Let me tell you what's my greatest challenge in writing. My reader, let's say, starts reading my book in bed at night before she goes to sleep, and she falls asleep, and I don't know where she puts it down. I have to make sure that this book that falls on the floor next to her forgotten slippers for the night, that at that moment, wherever she left it, it's a place where she just, oh my God, I have to find out what's next. She wakes up the next morning. She has a very big day. She has to get the kids to school. She has to go to work. She has an obnoxious boss. Her mother calls her. They have a fight over the phone. She gets a call from the school nurse that the kid has gashed his chin. She then later on goes, has to shop in the supermarket. The supermarket bag rips and stuff fall down on the floor and on the ground in the parking lot. She drives home. The car overheats and sitting in traffic. She has a really miserable day. All through that day, I want her to think, oh my God, what happened next? All she wants is to go back to my book. And she finally gets there late at night after she washed the dishes, and maybe if she's a teacher, she corrected papers, whatever she needed to do, and finally goes to bed, and she picks up the book because that's the most she wants to do. And no matter where she leaves the book, that's when. And then the book keeps her up half the night, but she has to get up the next morning, go on the next day. And that is the biggest challenge in creating a tension, that no matter where, in whatever sentence, whatever is the paragraph, whatever is the scene, the arc of the chapter, the arc of the story, I keep on ratcheting it up, letting down a little bit so the reader can catch her breath, because you can't just keep them, up, up, up. You need to let them breathe a minute, and then takes them higher into the story. And the more they're into the story, the more they can't let go, and they have to come back. And that is the challenge, and that is what I find that I'm able to give my readers. And it's such a good feeling for me, because I give them these hours of enjoyment, even though it's emotionally wrenching, I must say. Mm-hmm. When they finish reading my books, the big thing that I constantly hear from readers is that they have thought about it, stayed with them for days. And it's a great feeling. I love to find a book that stays with me the next day and the day after. It's like in a movie, the same thing. If you still think about it the next day, you feel good about that. That is the pleasure, the satisfaction of a story.
That is amazing. And I never thought about that, where they go to sleep, book drops, and just lands on the right page. It's like, for some reason, I never thought about that. Oh, my goodness. I'll have to tell people that you make sure that the reader falls asleep and has that page open. I like that. That is amazing. Wow. And what's the best advice you can give to anybody at this point?
The best advice I give who?
To anyone, like to be a writer, or say, your cause or anything, just best advice in general.
Advice in general, I would say, don't say no to life. Mm-hmm. There's so many things happen, every day where we have an opportunity to do something. It can be random kindness. It can be an offer to take a picnic. It can be all kinds of things present themselves in front of us, and we sort them out. We filter so much out of our life, and I think it makes a lot richer when we say yes to life.
That is amazing, too, just like accepting a piece of chocolate, or wearing a favorite hat someone gave you, or even somebody gave you 2 tickets to the ballet.
And I mentioned random kindness. Random kindness is so important to just wherever happens around you. Of course, it leads to activism and do good to the world. And if we all do good, then the world is a better place. Mm-hmm. And so that's saying yes to life.
And I do agree with you, Talia. And Talia, just wanted to say you have been fantastic. Thank you for being on the program. Thank you for your time. Looking forward to having you again soon. Talia Carner, the author of Third Daughter, to be released September 3rd, published by HarperCollins. And you also have Puppet Child, China Doll, Jerusalem Madam, and Hotel Moscow, and just a few more things. What are some of your upcoming projects? What's the website, and how do people contact you, and where can people purchase your books?
Okay. The first question regarding what's my next project, all I can say is that a trip to France 3 years ago, on a trip, I glanced a road sign. And as a result of that, I went back to France 4 times already in these past 3 years to research that particular situation, event. And now I need many, many months of clear head to write that book. But with the upcoming book tour, I don't see that happening in the next few years before I have another novel. That's one question. The other one, my website is www.taliacarner.com, TALIACARNER.com, and under that, the listeners can read the first chapter of all of my 5 novels, and in each one there are links to purchasing, be it online stores, or I always encourage, there is always a button for the indie store. That is your independent bookstore in your own town, village, neighborhoods. Those are very important institutions of culture that we need to support. So I encourage you to click on that one, put your zip code, and find which independent store in your area carries my books, or you order it through them. And what was the last question? I would like to say thank you very much for listening to me.
And it's been a pleasure, Talia, and thank you for your time, and look forward to having you on again soon. And please do everybody a favor, including me, keep us up to date.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to The Mike Wagner Show, powered by Sonic Web Studios. Visit online at sonicwebstudios.com for all your needs. Listen online at themikewagnershow.com and on Facebook, SoundCloud, Spreaker, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. And watch the interview on YouTube. Also, become a sponsor of the program and or donate today at themikewagnershow.com. Join us again tomorrow for another episode of The Mike Wagner Show.